I'm Wendy Rinke from the University of Missouri, and I'm presenting at the National Center for the Rural School Mental Health. The principal investigators on this research by the Institute of Education Sciences is myself, Keith Herman from the University of Missouri, Catherine Bradshaw from the University, and Carol Ewan, who is from the University of Montana. Today, I'm just going to give an overview of our multi-tiered system model of mental health supports in schools. And I'm going to show you some fall comparison data looking at data from the current rural schools that are in our trial and some rural schools that have been doing this model with us for the past 8 years. So the timeline for the center is for the first 2 years, we worked on developing and refining a universal screening system and reporting assessment that we implement with schools that identifies students who would benefit from supports, but also helps schools to identify universal prevention interventions and intervene across a number of different risk factors we know are associated with mental health risk. In year 3, we did a feasibility test with 30 rural schools where we tested out and talked with schools about what they liked, what they didn't like, and then we refined that. And now we're in the stage where we are actually evaluating this model with a randomized control trial in 110 schools across 3 states. So our school partners are, for the initial development, we've been working with 6 school districts here in Missouri that had 54 schools. We developed this universal screener with them. We actually had a partnership grant several years ago where we worked with them on refining that screener, validating it. And then we also did some studies looking at if fidelity to the model predicted better outcomes for students, which interestingly it does. And so I'll show you some data about that later. The feasibility trial, we spread out to additional schools in Montana and Colorado, and currently we're in 16 schools across Missouri and Montana. And we're evaluating about 33,000 students every year using this universal screener. What's really important to know is that about 20% of our school-aged youth experience serious mental health problems, yet few of them receive services, and this is even worse in rural settings where they are resource poor and don't have a lot of access to services. And so this model that we've built is really a comprehensive model to help identify, prevent, and intervene in mental health problems for youth across grades K through 12. And it's a comprehensive model where we identify using universal screening. And then we prevent, and I'll show you reports that schools get back using this model where they look at data to identify areas that they could use universal prevention interventions, and then selective and indicated interventions for students who are higher at risk. The early identification system covers several different subdomains that we know if you can intervene early in these areas, you can prevent long-term ingrained kind of problems in youth. And so attention and academic issues we know are related to school failure, as well as depression and externalizing problems, preventing or peer relationship problems, externalizing problems, internalizing problems, emotional dysregulation, school disengagement, and bullying behaviors. So it's a really comprehensive screener that we have both a teacher version and a student version that all schools implement at least twice a year. So they're usually in the fall and then again in the spring. The teacher version is unique because it's kind of quick, it's fast, it's dirty. One of my colleagues, Aaron Thompson, who's a social work faculty here at University of Missouri, developed this when he was actually a principal in an alternative school, and he just wanted to get a quick snapshot of what was going on with the kids in the building. And so he asked teachers to fill out what we call a checklist. And it just has the students' names down the left, as you can see, and it has symptoms across the top. And so the teacher can just look at like a block of kids and say, oh, yeah, Wyatt blames others, and just quickly check the boxes that fit for each of those kids. And so elementary teachers who have one classroom, this takes only about 10 minutes for them to complete. And then we have a student version where students start taking this in 3rd grade through 12th grade. It's all the same items, which allows us to aggregate that data across schools, across districts, and across communities, really, to look at what are the symptoms and problems that we're experiencing across settings. And so it's a really easy, it's a 36 questions. Students take it, takes them about 5 to 15 minutes, and they do this twice a year also. So then that data is, one of the unique things about this universal screener is it's locally normed. And so it doesn't, some screeners, if you take them, they're nationally normed, they're like, if you're at a high risk school, like half of your kids will look like they're at risk, and that sort of overwhelms the system, and there's not enough resources for that. And so what we've done is we locally norm this data, so within buildings, so each building then gets reports back, and kids are standardized. And so for this first report, this is our prevention report, where we look at teacher report of different symptoms. And basically what we do here is it turns red if more than 20% of the students in the building are at risk for one of these factors, because, you know, we say if more than 20% of kids are at risk for this, then you can't intervene one kid at a time. You need to do something more universal. And so if something pops up red, problem solving teams look at this and they say to themselves, oh, this attention academic issues is really red. Let's think about a universal prevention intervention that we could do across the school to help with that. And so that leads to prevention efforts. We also have a student report, very similar, red, yellow, green, indicating where you need to do more universal versus individual or selective supports. And the unique factor, one of the unique features of this is you can click on sort of a red area and it'll populate the number, names of kids on the right that have that risk. So for instance, there's an item that says, there's not an adult in the building that I feel comfortable talking to. And so if you wanted to know who the kids were that said that they never have an adult to talk to, you can click on that and then you can go directly to their individual reports. So the identification piece comes down to looking at individual students. And this is a teacher-student comparison report that populates, and kids turn, they have red indicators when they are 2 standard deviations above the mean in their school. So meaning that they're at the continuum of like very high risk. And so you can see the Z-scores in here. And so the first student in this demo has 3.72 standard deviations above their peers. So that means that they have elevated risk for peer relationship problems. You can click on that name and it'll take you to these individual reports where you can see how the teachers reported on them, as well as how they reported on themselves. And so problem solving teams can use these data to determine which kids need supports, what types of supports they need, and can also write notes and mark whether they're receiving services or not, so they can track that over time. And then when they're in their problem solving teams, there's actually a link in the EIS system that links them to something we call the Early Identification System Intervention Hub. And so if they're looking at their school-wide reports and they notice that externalizing behaviors is a universal risk for their school that they might want to identify a preventive intervention for, they can simply kind of click on externalizing behaviors. They say, I'm an elementary school, and then I want a tier 1 universal support system. And it pulls up one-pagers of evidence-based interventions that we know that if you implement them with fidelity in schools, actually change that risk factor for schools. And so it's each area has a menu of options that schools can choose that let them identify and link them directly to resources. Most of them are free. They can download materials and use those in their schools readily. And for this last part, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some data that we have. We are currently conducting a randomized control trials in the very first year of this. We're currently in 18 rural schools, 39% are elementary, 33% are middle school, and 28% are high school. They are all, the intervention schools are doing the early identification system, and they're receiving the reports, and then they have monthly consultation with our team that helps them use that data, implement, go into the intervention hub and identify things and implement. Our control schools are also doing the early identification system, but they are not getting the reports or monthly consultation. They will be getting that. They're actually completing them this month, and they will get the reports this month and get monthly consultation going forward. So because I don't have the post data, this was great that Emily asked me to do this, because it made us think like, hey, we have these county schools that have been doing this for 8 years, and then we have this new set of rural schools that have never implemented, and so and they're collecting the same data, and so we can actually look and compare and see how they're different at this point. And interestingly, like very similar, like elementary school, middle school, high school. So we have a sample of about 4,000 students in our county schools, and about 4,000 students in these rural center schools that we recently collect data in. And so I just was like, let me go look at the data and see how it differs based on their fall screener. And so what's really interesting is these are all the subscales by student report. And in every indication, our rural schools who've been doing this model for the past 8 years, they're statistically significantly lower on those subscales than the new rural schools that just started who have not implemented. And then similarly, by teacher report, we have about 6,000 students. We have teacher report for, and about 5,000 students for the rural schools that have not implemented. And very similar findings in every subscale. The teachers are reporting that our county schools have lower risk. And so that's really exciting to us to think that maybe this model is actually doing something well out there if you can do it for multiple years. And we'll see how the new rural centers do. But I also wanted to look at whether is it just that their mean levels are lower, or do we actually have less kids who are demonstrating risk? And so what we did here was we took our data and we z-scored it across all schools at grade level, and then looked at the number of students who were at risk based on being 2 standard deviations higher than their peers at that grade level. And we're seeing that we have fewer students in our county schools that are demonstrating risk as compared to the rural center schools who have not implemented across all domains. So again, very interesting, exciting. Same thing with teacher report. So less students demonstrating risk across all domains for teacher report. And then lastly, one of the things that the CDC recently reported that there's increasing risk nationally for high school students who are saying that they're persistently feeling sad and hopeless. And so the 2021 data came out recently where 57% of female high school students in our country are saying that they are persistently sad or hopeless, and 29% of males. And so we have sort of similar data. It's not exactly the same. But we have an item that asked students if they had felt sad in the past month, or if they felt hopeless in the past month. And so we just looked at data at same timeline, 2017 to 2021, and we looked at whether those students had reported at any time that they felt sad or hopeless through the year. And what we have in our county schools is this downward trend, which is converse to what we're seeing nationally. But because it wasn't exactly the same data, the last thing I did was looked at this sad or hopeless these items for our county versus our rural center schools. And we continue to see that there's a very much lower indication by both female and male students compared in our county compared to our rural center. And so that makes, I got to present this to the superintendents in our county schools, and they were so excited to see this and they want to share it widely. So Emily, thank you for making me do this so they could take a look at that. Next steps, we're going to finish our RCT. We're developing something we're calling an implementation hub. So it's going to have implementation supports and sustainability supports on there. And we're doing some youth participatory action research with our youth research partners. We have some high schoolers. We hired them. We're paying them $20 an hour to hang out with us and help us figure out how to make high school students understand why it's important for screening and how we use the data, and then, how to destigmatize some of the mental health issues in rural schools. Just some references, just my funder, and thank you very much.
My name is Kathleen Lynn Lane, And I wanted to thank Emily for the opportunity to share a little bit of information about our IES funded project from the integrated network, the MTSS network. And I wanted to first give an acknowledgement to the multiple co-PIs on this project, as well as Mark Buckman and Rebecca Sherrod, who are directing. And for this opportunity, there is a network that was funded, and there were specifically 4 different projects, all funded under IES, with the goal of learning more about the design, implementation, and evaluation of complex integrated systems. And there were 4 awarded. There was 1 awarded to Nate Clemens at UT Austin, another to Allison Gandhi through AAR, and she works very closely with Erica Lemke, and then Michael Coyne and Brandy Simonson and Betsy McCoach are co-PIs on the project out of UConn. And then there's a network lead that is coordinating all 4 of these projects together. So this is a substantial investment, and one that we think is really important, because at this time in history, we want to make sure that we are meeting students' multiple needs in a way that also protects teacher well-being and gives people the information that they need to know to really consider how to best support students in an integrated way that allows us to do really good data-informed decision-making. So today I'm going to spend just about 10 minutes telling you a little bit about CI3T, the work that's been done to date, and tell you where we are in this particular project. CI3T was actually started in the late 90s, specifically in 1996. And at the time, it was one of the first models that brought on the scene to also, in addition to looking at academics and behavior, with behavior being positive behavior intervention support, it also built in social and emotional well-being with the idea of having one integrated decision-making model. And as part of that, systematic screening was also new on the scene at the time. So there was a tool, the student risk screening scale, that we have since expanded also through the funds of IES, thanks to Project Screen. And I hope I get another opportunity sometime to tell you about the great things that we're learning about how that tool functions similarly for kids that are boys and girls, students that are white and Black, kids that are Hispanic and not Hispanic, and kids that are receiving special education services, and those who are not. But within a CI3T system, it is a data-informed approach for looking at academic data, behavior screening data, all completed by teachers 3 times a year. And then using that information, not just to focus on connecting kids to tier 2 and tier 3 supports, but also looking at the system to see, are our data telling us that we need adjustments at tier 1? And then secondly, in addition to looking at tier 1 happenings in the school, and it's not just looking at screening in isolation, it's also looking at multiple sources of data, office discipline referral, attendance, and reading performance beyond just those measures. But looking at those sources of information to not only look at tier 1, but to help look in teachers' classrooms to see if there's specific teachers that might benefit from a greater focus on like low intensity supports to maximize engagement and limit disruptions. We really want to empower teacher. So the screening data within this model are used in an integrated way to look at tier 1, support teachers by empowering their skill sets, and also connect kids to these extra supports. And right now, that whole process of building a CI3T model has been manualized, and the focus of this project, called Project Enhance, has been to learn more about how to build on some questions that actually came up out of a research partnership grant funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. And we closely partnered with one district, and in that district, there were questions at the end of it that left people wondering about, like, this system is working for us, but we need more. We need more about learning how to onboard new leaders into this model. We need more about how to think about building our professional learning capacity, and we need more direction on how to use systematic screening data in the ways I just described. So in the first year of this project, and we are currently in year 4, we did a series of studies, and this was all pre-pandemic. And I feel like the timing was actually perfect for this to happen. So we gleaned all this information about what people needed, and we have since disseminated that. And I'm proud to say that a lot of the first authors on these publications were at the time assistant professors. So what we learned in some of those first initial lessons learned, that there needed to be more explicit guidance on how to onboard people, communicate the vision of CI3T, and then provide really data-informed professional learning for the adults in the building that were expected to lead these integrated systems. That study was led by David Royer and Wendy Oakes. A second study on building capacity. We did a large scale study across the 35 schools that were participating at this time in the first year to find out what do you need more professional learning on and how do you want to access it. So these are some of the priorities that were placed at that time, looking at de-escalation techniques, social skills, and specifically about looking for kids with internalizing issues, which was great because all of these schools were prioritizing looking for both major disorders of childhood, externalizing and internalizing. And I should say all of these schools were using the student risk screening scale for internalizing and externalizing behavior. Even pre-pandemic, people told us that some of the ways that they preferred to access professional learning was during the day, as well as online courses. They also loved the idea of teacher collaborative networks, and they also wanted asynchronous opportunities. So that is something that we tuned into a lesson from that first year. And then finally, and I want to mention that study was led by Eric Common and Mark Buckman. Then Amy Breach and Sandy Shafoulias and Emily Iovina did a wonderful series of studies, both quantitative and qualitative, to learn more about what people perceived as the benefits of systematic screening. And in this sample were people that had been at the time implementing CI3T for 5 years, and some were in their first year of implementation. I think there was even a district that was in their 6th year. So we took all that information, and from that, we thought naively that we were going to build 8 modules that were going to support and meet the multiple needs of getting these complex systems in place. And what we quickly learned from people is that they needed more. So we now have approximately 25 different modules that were taking place. So as part of these modules, we've created a website that features these new modules that are currently available for use. And when you log into the module, what we're currently doing is it's all behind a password protected space. And it's allowing people that are currently participating in these projects to log in and access what we are calling these enhanced professional learning materials. Some of the modules that are created there are specific for leaders like these that you're looking at here. And what we learned from conversations with people is initially we came to all the participants in this study in the middle 2 years of this project, in years 2 and years 3, and we asked them through a series of usability and feasibility studies, we said, how do you want to access this? And so we crafted these ebooks that are all digital, free access ebooks that had the content that they had requested in the first year of the project. We also parallel made something called an interactive resource, and it's essentially like a tricked out PowerPoint. And then we said to them, which of these would you like? And because we were trying to get direction on what they felt that they needed. And they came back and said, we want both. So what we did is we created companion materials, and the feedback was this, is that people said, we like the interactive resources where we can essentially push and play and listen. And it's a series of interactions and simulations and informational graphics that can be shared out with people. And they also said they wanted it in a static form, like in an ebook, so that if they saw something that they thought could be useful in their own communities, with their families, with their faculty and staff, they could just quickly go to that space in the ebook and download it and use it. So in the pages of these books, there are a series of what I think are really well-designed information graphics, as I mentioned, very short videos, some scribe videos, some interactions. And by interactions, it's like these little simulations where you can answer questions and kind of go down different paths. And this design work was largely led by David Royer, who has exceptional skills in this area, and our full PI team. Amy Breach has devoted massive amounts of time to writing out the content of these. And in these, we're helping people to build their own clarity on what is this process that it takes, not to just design a good integrated system, but how do I get it in place? So it's things like clarifying what are all the meetings and communication structures that need to be done. So when does my team come together? When do I come together at the district level? What opportunities do I need at specific school sites to make those times to come together to look at data? And then there's an entire series of professional learnings, not just for the leadership teams in each building, but also faculty and staff. And that was a big piece where people are saying, give us more resources so that we as a CI3T leadership team or a district team have the resources we need to put the resources in hands of faculty and staff to support that decision making. So in addition to scheduling time like we were enjoying with these teams where they came together, and now we're in the pandemic at this point in the study. So they're coming together on Zoom and virtual environments. And we obviously cut out all the windshield time because people were logged in, but it was in these times, and they came together in a series of 5 2-hour sessions held throughout the last 2 years to develop these. But now you'll see these different resources, things like how to manage challenging behaviors, because that was something that came up right away as being a priority. And so there was clarities like of making sure that the content came from the scientific community, like building on the great lessons learned, like from Jeff Colvin and Terry Scott, Hill Walker, and others, like beginning with empathy and maintaining the flow of instruction. And those ideas about teaching those big parts at tier 1 in a really respectful, responsible way, not using screening data to exclude kids, but to really think about how am I going to support these positive, productive learning environments. So there's things like these little videos, as well as the interactions that I mentioned. And right now, what we are currently doing in the final 2 years of this project is we have a learning opportunity where we are currently working with 22 what we're calling seasoned implementers to continue to explore these enhanced professional learning resources. And in addition, we are, thanks to the support from then Commissioner Joan McLaughlin and now interim the interim commissioner, Jackie Buckley, we are engaged in an underpowered RCT where we are comparing people that are schools that were assigned to receive this enhanced professional learning experience relative to those that receive the traditional professional learning experiences. I want to emphasize that the learning objectives for the teams participating are the same in both conditions. What is varying is the availability of these professional learning resources. And so if you are interested in learning more about the specific questions, just in brief, we have questions about how is this implementation happening and what do people think about it? An important part of our work is also based on teacher well-being. In one of our partnership grants that we had, we learned that teachers fare better, and this is pre-pandemic, in CI3T models. And specifically, teachers reported that after 2 years of being in CI3T schools, whether they're in the elementary or middle and high school, they reported lower burnout rates than the national average and a higher sense of efficacy in their teaching, not in every domain, but in several. And so we want to see if that is also true. And another benefit of these CI3T models and other integrated systems is that with these data, we can have the opportunity to unpack it to make sure that we look to see how different groups of students are responding to these different supports. And lastly, Sandy Shafoulias and Kate Williams are leading a cost analysis of the traditional and enhanced condition. And to support open sciences practices, this is recorded and posted on Open Science Frameworks. So thank you for listening and learning a little bit more about CI3T. And we are excited, hopefully, to be back here next year to share preliminary outcomes from this first year of implementation in this 2-year study that is the underpowered randomized control trial. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lauren Angelo from the Institute of Education Sciences and the Evaluation Center. I'm the project officer for the impact evaluation of multi-tiered systems of support for behavior, or MTSSB. I'm here with my colleague, Barbara Conduit from NDRC, who's the deputy project director and the report primary author. So I'm going to share a quick snapshot of the study and what we found, and then Barbara will take over to unpack what we learned. We were motivated to conduct this study for a few key reasons. We knew we needed to shed light on how to support students' behavior due to its important contribution to students' later outcomes. And federal and state leadership have really encouraged the adoption of MTSSB to address student behavior. And subsequently, adoption has been pretty widespread. However, when the study began, there was limited information about which MTSSB programs worked and for whom. So the team competitively selected a promising MTSSB training program developed by the Center for Social Behavior Support to study. And at a high level, we found that the program improved the outcomes of 15% of students who were initially identified as struggling the most in terms of their disruptive behavior when the program began. And these improvements did not spill over to students overall. So this exhibit displays what the study evaluated. And we're going to start with the practices or systems that the study intended to put in place on the right of the arrows. First, intended implementation included school-wide behavior support practices, or Tier 1 for all students. And in Tier 1, school staff teach expected behavior in various school contexts. Students practice these behaviors with staff feedback. Staff reward appropriate behavior and reteach behavior when needed. Additionally, staff consistently and proactively implement targeted classroom management strategies. I'm moving to the top box on the right, and that depicts the provision of additional supports or supplemental supports for students who need it. So this is tier 2. And these supports were intended to be provided to up to 15% of students in year 2. And in tier 2, schools were trained to implement check-in, check-out. So each morning, targeted students were to check in with a familiar, consistent staff person who reminds students of the expected behaviors and provide encouragement. During the day, teachers increase their feedback to students and record student behavior on a card. And finally, students check out at the end of the day and are either retaught behavior, rewarded, or both. And these practices were supported by school teams, and these teams lead, monitor, and support the implementation of the practices. They monitor students' behavior and progress and identify students for supplemental supports. And these schools were also supported by an MTSS coach who spent 1 day a week in each participating school. In this study, we focused only on tiers 1 and tier 2. And that was because that's where we saw the most evidence. And there was also some concern that training schools beyond these 2 tiers in the course of the study could get too burdensome. Moving on to the yellow box, how the study intended to get these practices in place, or the far left box. So initially, the provider advised districts in identifying behavior coaches and a behavior support team, also in installing and learning a behavior data system. The provider taught teams in the core practices and helped them to develop school-specific implementation plans, and training was offered to school teams on classroom management practices and how to train and support all classroom teachers in their use. Technical assistance was provided throughout the 2 implementation years. And of note, the training on tier 1 was completed prior to implementation year 1, and training on supplemental supports was conducted immediately prior to program year 2. A little bit of information about the evaluation itself. The study had a large sample of about 90 elementary schools, and these schools, based on our recruitment priorities, tended to be large and urban. They served a larger share of students from low-income families, students who are Hispanic, and students who had limited English proficiency compared to schools nationally. And these schools were randomly assigned to either participate in the MTSS training program or continue with their current practices. And I want to highlight that we evaluated one way of implementing MTSS, and there are a whole host of ways that schools could go about implementing these systems. So our study is of this one program and not MTSS more generally. The providers supported schools for 2 years, and then schools were followed for an additional year to see if the practices were sustained. And the key outcomes we looked at are student behavior and achievement, school climate, classroom management and functioning, and behavior support policies and practices. And to determine whether the program was effective, analyses compared the outcomes of students in the participating schools to those in non-participating schools. And analyses were conducted for students overall, as well as for the 15% of students initially identified as struggling the most with behavior in these schools. At this point, I'll turn the presentation over to Barbara, who's going to unpack what we learned.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Okay, so as Lauren just shared, no differences in student behavior were found between students in participating and non-participating schools. For example, and as shown here, at the end of year 2, students' disruptive behavior, for example, being aggressive, was similar in schools participating in the program and those that were not. Consistent with this lack of improvement in disruptive behavior, the program also did not improve other aspects of student behavior that the study explored. And all aspects of student behavior were measured by teacher ratings on a commonly used 0 to 5 point scale, with higher values reflecting more frequent displays of the behaviors. Okay. So in understanding these findings, we think it's really important to note that despite participating schools' interest in implementing the program, joining the study to reduce problematic student behaviors, schools had relatively low levels of these behaviors at the start of the first study year. And this may have limited room for the program to improve student behaviors. So as you can see on this slide, at the outset of the study, disruptive behaviors were typically rated by teachers as occurring between 0 and 1, so never and rarely for students. Okay, so let's move on. So while the program was not explicitly directed at increasing academic achievement, it was hypothesized to have that effect through improvements in student behavior or improvements in classroom or the school environment more generally. And because the program did not result in improved behavior in either program year for students overall, it is not surprising that there were no effects on achievement at the end of each program year or in the follow-up year. Now, the MTSSB school-wide practices could be especially important for students already exhibiting disruptive behavior. These students may have greater challenges understanding the behavior expectations and meeting them, which could result in more negative interactions with their teachers. And as a result, as Lauren mentioned, the study also investigated the impact of the program on students who were identified as struggling with behavior at the study's outset. So at the end of the first program year, when only the school-wide Tier 1 MTSSB practices were underway, these students in participating schools showed less disruptive behaviors than their counterparts in non-participating schools. And these findings of less disruptive behavior among this group of students represents a reduction of approximately 1/3 in the rate of increase in disruptive behavior that schools typically experience from the start to the end of the school year on this measure. As shown on this slide, this effect on disruptive behavior persisted into the second program year. Now, Lauren mentioned that there was the introduction of supplemental supports in year 2, so we might have expected to see an increase in the effects of the program on these students' disruptive behavior in year 2. However, we found only about 20% of these students initially identified as struggling the most with behavior at the study's outset were reported by their teachers to have actually received that supplemental behavior support in year 2. And so this limited receipt might explain why the effects of the program on student behavior for this subgroup did not increase in year 2 when those supports were introduced. Now, behavior was not measured after the study's training and technical assistance ended, so the effect of the program on student behavior in the follow-up year is not known. Okay. So moving on to academics, we also see effects on academic achievement and reading for these students initially struggling the most with behavior. At the end of the first program year, these students in participating schools scored higher on average on state reading tests than their counterparts in non-participating schools. The difference in students' scores on participating and non-participating schools represent about 2.4 months of extra learning, or about 1/4 of the typical annual gain in reading skills. This positive effect on reading achievement was sustained, but did not increase for these students in the second year of the program. And we don't see any effect in the follow-up year for reading or in any year for math. Okay, so let's explore what could have led to these findings. Here you see the study's assessment of Tier 1 implementation in year 1, 2, and the follow-up year after the study's training and technical assistance ended. The study used the school-wide evaluation tool to assess implementation fidelity of the Tier 1 practices. And so what you see here for each year, the set of bars on the left is the average Tier 1 fidelity score for each set of schools. And to the right is the set of bars that displays the percent of schools that meet the established thresholds for implementation with fidelity on this measure, so 80% or higher. And you can see that the average scores were fairly high each year in participating schools. About 70% of participating schools in year 1 and 80% of those schools in year 2 met the threshold for implementation with fidelity. And you can see that the fidelity is much stronger in the treatment schools as expected than the non-participating schools. However, you can see in those mean scores that the non-participating schools had some aspects of MTSSB in place to some degree. Okay. So this next slide shows you the implementation of Tier 2 or the supplemental supports, which was measured by an adaptation of the individual student systems evaluation tool, the ISET. And as a reminder, these supports were introduced in participating schools in year 2 of the study. So as expected then, the year 1 results on the far left, they show that fewer than 1/4 of schools were implementing Tier 2 with fidelity before the training was provided. But after the training was provided, about 3/4 of participating schools met the threshold for implementing Tier 2 with fidelity. And in year 2, this was sustained. It was sustained in the follow-up year, year 3 of the study. And as you can see, this implementation in year 2 and the follow-up year was much stronger in the participating schools compared to the non-participating schools. So there was fairly good implementation, but of course there were some reported challenges by MTSSB team and school leadership, which we think are important to note. So with regards to Tier 1 school-wide supports, about 40% of the Tier 1 team leaders reported a lack of alignment between the philosophy of carrying out MTSSB and the beliefs of the teachers and staff. So for example, team leads reported that staff sometimes didn't think that students needed to be taught how to behave or that displaying appropriate behavior warranted rewarding. This challenge is not uncommon, and it was certainly predicted by the training providers who attempted to develop buy-in throughout the training period by presenting things like evidence on these practices and even comparing instruction and behavior to academics. But it seems that the challenges in some schools still persisted. And we know this is important as buy-in is generally associated with better implementation. Also, about a quarter of interviewed team leaders noted challenges with understanding the program or time and demands in the program as a barrier to implementation. In regards to the supplemental supports, students and staff consistent participation was the most often cited challenge by Tier 2 team leaders. And staff's perception of this challenge really aligns with the study's data on participation in the Tier 2 intervention, which showed that on average, approximately 5% of a school student population enrolled in Tier 2. And that's lower than what the training provider's guidance was, which was to enroll closer to 7 to 12%. Based on the theory of action, carrying out the MTSSB practices, which we found were implemented generally pretty well by participating schools, was expected to improve behavior and achievement through some key mechanisms. So including helping schools develop a more positive climate. And we find that the program improved some, but not all aspects of school climate closely linked with the theory of change. So what you see here at the end of year 2, staff members in participating schools rated teacher-student relationships, academic focus, and staff collegiality more favorably than those in non-participating schools. But there were no improvements on other measures, including consistent school discipline, school safety, and principal leadership. Okay, so through training and coaching and classroom management strategies, the program was also expected to improve teachers' classroom management, which could clearly improve student behaviors and academic achievement. And we find that the training and TA program improved all aspects of classroom management that were assessed. So this included facilitating orderly transitions, appropriate anticipation and responsiveness to student behavior, proactive behavior management, and active monitoring. Now, these impacts weren't surprising given the focus of classroom management in the training. Okay, and now finally, we see improvements in how teachers manage the classrooms. We also see with this slide that the program improved how their classrooms functioned. So starting with the table on the left side of the slide, the classrooms in participating schools generally seem to improve in the extent of disruptions, student engagement and compliance, so that's rule following, and teacher control or influence over the classroom. Now, these dimensions so far are the product of summative ratings by the observers after an observation period. However, during the 15-minute observation period, trained observers also counted each time there was any display of disruptive behavior. This could be a student not complying with staff directions to students being verbally or physically aggressive. And what you see on the right-hand side of the slide is that just based on these objectives ratings, there was a reduction in the instances of disruptive behavior in classrooms of participating schools by about 2 disruptions every 15 minutes. So that is, classrooms and schools participating in the program typically had about 7 disruptions every 15 minutes compared to about 9 in classrooms and schools that did not participate. One thing to keep in mind here, based on these classroom observations, is we don't know which students drove those disruptions. So for example, whether disruptions were common across all students or whether there were 1 or 2 students who led to the counts of disruptions. So to understand individual student behaviors, we relied on the teacher ratings of student behaviors, which we previously shared. Okay, so to summarize, we see that our participating schools implemented MTSSB fairly well and better than non-participating schools. We saw improvements in classroom management overall and some aspects of school climate, and ultimately improvements in the disruptive behavior and achievement of students most in need, but not students overall. So in order to explore the theory of action, we looked at whether impacts or improvements in school and classroom outcomes were related to impacts on student outcomes. These analyses provide opportunities to better understand how the MTSSB approach did and didn't work, which may suggest ways to strengthen the program. For students overall, we don't find strong relationships or supports for links in the expected theory of action. And this isn't entirely surprising, as we didn't see impacts for students overall. But for the subgroup of students initially identified as struggling the most with behavior at the study's outset, we do see some support for the links in the theory of action. So specifically, we see a relationship between tier 2 implementation and improvements in these students' behavior. We also see that improvements on some aspects of classroom management and school climate were linked to improvements in these students' disruptive behavior, which was the primary focus of the program. However, these classroom and school improvements do not seem to be related to improvements in reading achievement. Instead, in some exploratory analyses not shown on this slide, but in the report, we see that effects on less emphasized aspects of the program, such as students' attention to schoolwork, are potentially related to effects on reading achievement. More on that in just a second. So what do these findings suggest about considerations program developers and schools could make as they consider this approach to implementing MTSSB? First, this type of program may be more beneficial where student behavior is a significant challenge. The subgroup of students initially identified as struggling the most with disruptive behavior in this study, for whom we see positive impacts on behavior and reading achievement, displayed similar or less disruptive behavior than the average student in schools participating in previously published studies of MTSSB that found effects on students overall. Schools and providers may want to consider ways to assess behavior issues and among students before significant investments in adopting MTSSB strategies are made. Second, to boost these programs' effects on student achievement, program developers and educators might consider enhancements to MTSSB that take advantage of the smoother functioning of classrooms and more directly target behaviors affecting academic instruction and learning. This is particularly promising given the exploratory analyses I just shared that suggest one mechanism might be this potential relationship between these less emphasized behaviors, such as attention to schoolwork and student reading achievement for those students initially identified as struggling the most with behavior. Finally, future research and implementation efforts could seek to better understand and address some of these barriers to consistent participation in Tier 2 support. Among students initially identified as struggling with behavior, better implementation of Tier 2 is associated with larger impacts on student disruptive behavior. But we know schools enrolled relatively few students in the intervention. So we think addressing behaviors to student and staff participation in Tier 2 could help better realize its potential to promote equity and educational outcomes for students most in need of support. And there, thank you.
Hey, this is Kent McIntosh from the University of Oregon, and I have the honor of being the discussant for this panel we have here. So I want to thank Emily and IES for this opportunity to be able to share. I want to thank Wendy and Kathleen for presenting really impressive systems that they've put together. And I want to thank Barbara and Lauren for sharing the results from a really rigorous trial and a needed trial of MTSSB. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some of my thoughts from seeing these sessions, and hopefully it's a good opportunity for us to have some discussion throughout afterwards and beyond, with this really laser focus on thinking about MTSS and equity. So these are a few things that I was sort of thinking through. So number one, this group of presenters, and me especially, represent those who are probably most likely to benefit from our universal systems that we have. And we have this real obligation to consider that when we're building the systems and researching these systems. Because it's very easy for me, for example, to put something in place that really gets in the way of improving outcomes for students who are least likely to benefit from those systems. So one of the things that I was really excited about hearing was Wendy describing how they're engaging youth and paying youth to provide ways of improving those systems, which is really exciting to see, and the fact of having that participatory research to help improve what we're trying to do, which is improve outcomes for students, which I think is great. I also wanted to sort of share kind of for me, one of my concerns and worries just about universal screening systems. So universal screening systems are great in terms of trying to identify students with the most needs and trying to find students who might fall through the cracks. But we have to kind of wrestle with this idea that those universal screening systems are inherently deficit focused. And if we're not careful, we may be leading educators to center problems within students as opposed to centering problems within systems. And Kathleen was talking about that throughout. And so our universal screening systems shouldn't just identify students in need. They should really be the outcomes of those screeners should be used to identify the health of our prevention systems and point to how we can improve our universal interventions. And both Wendy and Kathleen talked about how they would use those data. You know, essentially, if you find a ton of students needing support, you can't intervene one by one, which is what Wendy was describing so well. And so that kind of brings me to this area of thinking about, okay, universal screening systems can work well and are an important part of MTSS, but I really want us to be thinking about focusing on tier 1 supports and the promise of tier 1 supports, especially for students with the most needs, or the ones who are least likely to benefit from our systems. When we provide really good universal systems for our students, their families, and their communities, we get to provide preventive support and the support that students need without singling them out, without providing stigma, and also without any false negatives that we might have for students who really are falling through the cracks in terms of our need. And that kind of leads me to this last point, that MTSS isn't working until it works for our most marginalized and minoritized learners. And whether those are students who are Black or African American students, students with disabilities, Black students with disabilities, gay, lesbian, and trans kids. If our systems aren't working for those groups of students, then we don't have really good systems. And one of the things that I like to think of, this quotation, this is Pedro Noguera, who is the dean of the School of Education, the University of Southern California. He's got this great quotation that I think works really nicely. If you ran a hospital, but were only known for serving people who are healthy, well, then you wouldn't be a very good hospital. And so when I think about equity and when I think about MTSS and equity, it's going to be very problematic if our universal systems are identifying almost entirely students of color, students with disabilities for support. You cannot tier 2 or tier 3 your way to equity in terms of student outcomes. And that's because equity is a tier 1 issue in the work that we do. We really can't add more and more interventions, as evidence-based as they are, if our systems are unhealthy for the students who need it the most. And then I want to just finish with a few comments on that really great presentation about the MTSSB trial, which is so needed and so important. And I'm really thankful for Barbara and Lauren for sharing that. We created a brief with a few key points that are related to that, primarily for educators, leaders, policymakers, to be able to put those results in context. So one of the things that I think of is, and I think they described it really well, is that the schools that were recruited for the study and participated weren't necessarily ones who needed it as much as maybe previous studies and so on. And there are previous studies, rigorous randomized control trials showing outcomes, not just for students with the most need, but also for all students. But I'm going to argue that improving outcomes for students with the most needs is one of the main goals of MTSS anyways. So if we think about effectiveness and the students who we're really trying to reach, I think these outcomes really show the value of this MTSSB approach. A few other things that I think I was keying in on from that description: we should not expect behavior support to automatically lead to improved academic outcomes. If we want to improve academic outcomes, we've got to provide high quality academic instruction as well. You probably also saw in those descriptions, especially those exploratory ones, those changes in classroom practices of the teachers is really key. And one of the things that was sort of unique about this trial was the extent of classroom coaching that teachers involved in this study received. And that does seem to be related to the outcomes that came out, that teachers felt really supported by their coaches. And we saw those changes in some of those exploratory outcomes related to classroom environment, like improved teacher-student relationships and so on. And then the last one is once those supports were removed, because this was a randomized control trial and there was only enough funding and time to be able to follow, those outcomes started to diminish. And so with randomized control trials, where it's really difficult to provide district infrastructure for implementation, it's actually a pretty good cautionary tale that one-time trainings without establishing district systems of support are only likely to lead to short-term improved outcomes, if any. So you can take a look at that brief if you want to. It's on the website at pbis.org. And here's contact information. I want to thank the presenters. I really appreciated getting a chance to learn and hear about how they're improving systems for our most marginalized and minoritized learners, and look forward to further discussion here and beyond. Thank you. So I'm going to start it off, if it's all right, with a question, and this would be a question for first Wendy and then Kathleen. What is screening looking like post-COVID? I know what you were sharing. I shouldn't say post-COVID, but during COVID would be a better description of that. What are things looking like now in terms of systems and so on in this last school year and moving forward?
Wendy, do you go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. So our screening, we definitely saw some upward trends in our internalizing problems from kids, and peer relationship problems was popping up a little bit, I think just because those social interactions weren't there. During COVID, teacher report of externalizing behaviors was very low because there was no kids in the classroom. So that was sort of a result of that. But over, at least in Boone County, where we've been implementing this comprehensive prevention and intervention model for the past 8 years, we're seeing downward trends at this point. So it's looking better for our county in particular.
Yeah. One of the things that we noticed throughout the last couple of years is that people have been more committed to completing their systematic screening to measure internalizing and externalizing, even relative to academics. It has been like a big play in terms of priority. And we saw something similar. We haven't formally analyzed these data yet. But what we're seeing is we saw the same things, that initially there was a dip in terms of internalizing issues and externalizing when kids were first coming back into the classroom. And I'd be interested to hear Kent's thoughts on this, but part of me feels like that initial downward trend was because the expectations were crystal clear when kids came back in: routines, procedures, safety procedures, and they were using their school-wide structures to teach those behaviors, and they were afraid. So they were really followed, and it was, I think, a pretty safe, predictable place to be. But I've been appreciative that that's at the systems level and at the school site level, systematic screening has remained a priority with a clear commitment to both major disorders of childhood, internalizing and externalizing.
Oh, that's great. That's much more promising than I was expecting in terms of answers from both of you. So that's great. All right, I'm going to go to an audience question from the brilliant Michelle Woodbridge. I'm curious about that, and this is going to be for Barbara or Lauren. I'm curious about the selection of the particular MTSS training program for the national study. It seems like it was a constrained framework, not the comprehensive framework integrating social, emotional, academic, and mental health supports at all three tiers. How was that particular training program selected for the large-scale study, and were there any concerns about it meeting the definition for MTSS as we understand it?
Well, I can start, and then Lauren, I'd love to have you jump in here with the IES perspective as well. So in terms of the process used to select the training provider, we held a competitive process. So bringing together, we sort of spelled out the study's concept of MTSSB that was going to be evaluated for this study at the start, and held a competitive process bringing together experts in the field to rate different training providers on their proposals for how to operationalize that and provide training in the field. And just to note that we definitely understand and appreciate that there are multiple approaches to operationalizing MTSS in schools, and the study evaluated just one of those approaches. Lauren, would you say anything else on that?
Sure. Thanks, Barbara. And I do want to just emphasize that we tried to focus on a model that we could implement within the constraints of a randomized trial within just a couple of years, as we heard from the field that it could take anywhere from 3 to 6 years to get a full MTS model in place. So we started with a focus on behavior, and we started with a focus on tiers 1 and 2, partially because that's where the evidence was really giving us a good sense of where to go, versus tier 3, where we were less confident that the training would be fully evidence-based and could be operationalized within the context of a shorter study. So we tried to balance burden, we tried to follow the literature, and think about feasibility within a shorter study. I'm not sure if that fully addresses your question.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I think probably one of the distinctions is this was not an integrated MTSS trial, but an MTSSB or MTSS for behavior, social behavior trial in there. So within those constraints, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thanks. All right, I'm going to move to the next one. Thank you, Jason Snipes. So there's a lot of evidence that the same behaviors are more likely to be perceived as disruptions when they involve Black students versus their white counterparts, and that teachers systematic differential treatment of Black students increases the frequency of and disparities in actual and reported classroom disruption. Some of that documented by Jason Konfua at Cal Berkeley and some others. How do you think this affects that ability of MTSS training programs to have an impact, or our ability to accurately measure some of those outcomes? And clearly some of those outcomes are all filtered through perspectives of teachers as opposed to actual behaviors. Who wants to take that on? I see Kathleen, you've maybe unmuted on that one.
Yeah, if that's okay. And Jason, I don't know if this is going to be as direct as you're hoping for, but I wanted to share what I think is a piece of good information. I think part of accurately measuring what's happening in MTSS models is making sure that we have measures that do not have measurement bias, so that we know that the tool itself is functioning correctly. And I'm not saying it takes care of every inequity, but at least knowing that there isn't measurement and variance, or that basically you establish measurement and variance of the tool. And we have another project that I briefly mentioned in that video that I stumbled through, and it's called Project Screen. And it's a large scale study of the student risk screening scale for internalizing and externalizing. And that particular tool it's established, we just recently established measurement invariance to show that the teacher completed ratings for kids were showing that there was measurement invariance, meaning that the tool functioned the same way for boys and girls, kids that were white and compared to kids that were Black, kids that were white compared to kids of color, Hispanic, and those who are not Hispanic, those that are receiving special ed services and those who are not. And that was true for elementary, middle, and high in fall, winter, and spring, and longitudinal measurement invariance. And normally we would have unpacked that into several different manuscripts, but we felt like it was an important thing because I think part of doing any integrated system well is making sure that we have reliable, valid tools for you so that we can engage in really good decision making. So I am hopeful with the priorities placed on all types of screenings that the field will continue to advance, not just at the elementary, but also at the middle and the high school level, to look to make sure that we are being cautious and committed to doing those important tests. And I am not a methodologist, but I surround myself with really great people that I think can continue to move that forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for answering that, Kathleen, from a screening perspective. I'll chime in a little bit. I think that absolutely there's tons of evidence about racial inequities in school discipline, particularly for defiance and disruptions. And so what you're describing in there is very well true. And we do have some evidence, you go to pbis.org, that those who are implementing PBIS have lower racial disparities, but they're not entirely reduced. And so I was lucky enough to lead a team from a previous IES project where we added professional learning in implicit bias and culturally responsive teaching, and actually significantly decreased discipline outcomes for Black or African-American students. But the thing that was also really exciting is we also reduced exclusions across the school for non-Black students. So it's kind of nice to be able to show that, yes, we can decrease those disparities, and that good culturally responsive instruction and a systematic approach is actually good for all students. Okay, we've got time here if there are other questions that we've got, and I would also encourage other panelists or IES officers to ask some questions as well. You've got the floor and lots of people attending here. All right, here's another one from Michelle Woodbridge. Jason Snipes, excellent question. Made me reflect on observer training and reliability. To what extent are we training observers sufficiently enough to reduce or eliminate bias in their observations of disruptive behavior? How can we improve those training processes to ensure our objective measures are as accurate and reliable as possible? And I'm gonna tap Wendy Renke to answer this one, because I know she's got an active project looking at this understanding and connecting with observations, and then would also point you to the session yesterday and Jessica Badiani and her work in this area, looking at classroom observations as well. But Wendy, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, we use a tool that we've been using for, gosh, over a decade, the behavior or the brief classroom interaction observation. We use it across a lot of our studies. It's a 20-minute observation, and we spend a lot of time getting people reliable. I see Melissa Stormont is here. She was recently became reliable and was garnered Nerd of the Week for her enthusiasm. But we spend a lot of time outside of classrooms and inside of classrooms training on specific, very objective, measurable outcomes, including teachers' use of reprimands, disruptive behavior, aggressive behavior, opportunities to respond. I will say we published a paper, I think back in 2016, that looked at differential reprimands to students of color, and we found that teachers do actually reprimand particularly Black male students in their classrooms more, and that produced, we looked at outcomes on teacher ratings of prosocial versus disruptive behavior, and found that they also then towards the end of the year were rating those students as more disruptive. So over time, they kind of shaped each other's behavior, I believe. Whereas white girls, they had less reprimands and were rated as more prosocial at the end of the year. So I think you can get a very reliable objective measure, but you can then use those measures to determine if there is that bias occurring in the classrooms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. All of these things have some kind of level of subjectivity, but we can dial it in and get a little bit closer. We actually, kind of tagging on that, Wendy, in terms of that gender and race difference and intersectionality. We just completed a machine learning analysis of millions of office discipline referral comments. So when people write up an office referral, they have this open notes section. And, until recently, most of the time we've just suggested that people never look at that because it's a waste of time, as opposed to actually looking at graphs of the drop-down checklists. But with machine learning, we took a look and found that typically educators who are writing up referrals, they write longer notes for Black students and for boys. But they write more negative comments, and this is probably not too much of a surprise to people, for Black or African-American students and boys. However, the most negative comments were actually for Black or African-American girls, more than Black boys, more than white boys. And that kind of, I think you're keying at this, Wendy, the sort of violation of what is perceived as, the ideal. And sometimes that is a white girl ideal of what female identifying behavior is supposed to be.
Very interesting.
All right. Yeah. So look for that. Okay. Here's a question from Melissa Stormont. Was there a subset of schools with more fidelity? So I believe that we're talking about, this is going to you, Barbara and Lauren. So there a subset of schools with more fidelity and or with students with greater needs that could be analyzed to show if specific schools, even in this subgroup of students, responded better or had greater changes? So were there kind of moderation effects or maybe implementation of moderation effects by school characteristics? We'll see if Melissa nods if I got that right. All right, and we'll have to make it a little bit quick because I think we're done in 2 minutes.
Well, that's a great question, and I think an important one. So we do have some really good measures of implementation fidelity of both the tier 1 and tier 2 practices. We did do some exploratory analyses to look at variation in fidelity and relationships with impacts on students. I presented at the end of the video presentation some of the results of those exploratory analyses. Not surprisingly, since we don't see impacts on students overall for those measures, we don't see any significant correlations there. But we do see significant relationships between implementation of tier 2 practices and effects on students' disruptive behavior for that subgroup of students initially identified as struggling the most with behavior. And also just to note that eventually data from this trial becomes part of a restricted access file. So I think these are all great questions that could be asked of that data when it is available.
Excellent. Okay. So as we wrap up, and I did answer one of those typed in, and happy to connect afterwards, but we'd like you to, as we're sort of looking here, go to the session back on the web page and give us your rating, 1 to 5. 1 is lowest and high is highest, and any feedback you've got. Very, very happy to chat with you in relation to this. And then Jason Snipes, thanks for the comments. I would take a look at some of the work Catherine Bradshaw and Jessica Badiani have done in this area, some fantastic work. So I want to thank, and hopefully you join me in virtual applause for our panel here today, and for IES for this opportunity to be able to share all with you, and fantastic questions. Thanks all very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.